Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, and great to be here. Yeah, you mentioned Franciscan monk, and I had a mentor friar who I used to share stories about when I worked at Royal North Shore Sydney Hospital. And one of the things he said to me, he said, Michael, you know, patients will be your best teachers, and you need to think about how they shape you both personally and professionally. And I never really thought about that. You know, in my time, I thought I was the one doing the giving. So what we're going to hear about today really is around patient stories and how they can help shape us, both personally in our own lives, but also professionally, and how we can engage with their stories in a more sort of productive way. I often start with, what is a person-centred feedback system? So this is about patient feedback, and what are the sort of key things that we believe are sort of more person-centred than, I guess, and I'll be a little bit blunt here, than organisation-centric. So sometimes, I think you'd agree, the systems don't quite engage in a way that the public want us to engage, because it's just the way we do things. So some of the key things there might be that we start with the feedback person, not simply as a data source, but someone who cares about how their feedback is used. So we're very keen on gathering data. Data drives our organisations, and we want the data around patient experience. But I think what we need to start challenging ourselves with is, what does the person who gives us that data get back? What's in it for them to share their data about their experience? So we're starting to sort of turn the tables a little bit and look at this person-centred approach. I think a person-centred patient feedback system would encourage people to feedback about issues that matter to them, not necessarily the organisation. Now, often they overlap, but sometimes they don't. It will enable the people to see whether their feedback was read and by whom read their feedback to your organisations. So that's pretty key as well for a person-centred system. And it will allow them to communicate with those interpreting that data. So you're probably thinking, how is that going to happen? How do we get people who give us their feedback to see that, or to communicate with those interpreting and acting on it? I think a person-centred feedback system would allow a person, indeed everyone, to see whether their feedback made a difference and how. Even if it was positive feedback, what is that doing within the organisation? How do people learn from that feedback? And that brings me to that last point, which is around learning around feedback, not only within your organisations, but what about externally? We are one health system, are we not, across Australia, more or less? So how do we learn from each other? You know, how does Robbins from Lady Cilento learn from Princess Margaret Hospital in Perth about what patients are saying? So this is what I'm really going to focus on in the next 18 or so minutes. So what I've talked about here really is building this relationships with your patients, consumers, through a public online engagement in a safe way. So I'd imagine, you know, most of the people in the room are online, they're engaged with social media. So this is really I'm framing it within the public online feedback space. So patient opinion, you know, we're a not-for-profit both here in Australia and in other countries. It originated in the UK. And our mission really is to make it that sort of safe and simple for people to share their feedback, but also, and just as important, if not more important, for busy staff to learn from that feedback and to be able to access it. If you think about the question, on whose terms do we engage when we ask for patient feedback? Often it's our terms when we engage. And, you know, if you think of that vertical axis as being easy for services in terms of engaging with the public or the people that use their services, things like the family and friends test or patient surveys or patient focus groups, even formal complaints are what I would say relatively easy for services to do, because that's what you're doing, but a little bit more difficult for the public to engage in if they're not asked. And formal complaints is something that I don't think we can underestimate just how stressful that is, not only for the organisation, but for the people lodging that formal complaint, and how difficult it is for them to do that. I don't think any of us want to go into litigation. It's difficult for the public on that horizontal spectrum, and for services on the vertical spectrum, it's difficult to go down that track. What we're seeing now is blogging because of the online space. So it's easy for the public to get online, to shout about your organisation. If you go to Google reviews, you can Google, your organisation and look at Google reviews. People are talking about you, and whether it be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they're on there, they're chatting. But that's very difficult for you to engage with that unless you've got someone watching the Facebook site 24/7, looking at what people are saying and trying to ward that off. So the reason patient opinion and care opinion for social care was developed was for that very reason of making it easier for health services to engage more readily in that space in a productive way. So it was a win-win situation for the public and for health services. If you think about the left of that vertical line, those outputs are rather opaque to the public. We don't see that, what goes on in a formal complaint, or what goes on when you've got your surveys and analyse the data. We don't often see the ins and outs of that. Whereas on the right-hand side of that vertical line, the outputs are transparent to the public. And I think both are important, but I think you need both. You need to really have both integrated and working off each other. Patients too have expectations of online feedback. There's been a lot of work done in this area. They do want it to be independent. They're worried about organisations that ask them to get online and say things because they're worried it will be skewed. They want to make sure their stories are in safe hands and that the organisations are responsive. Anonymity is really important. I often hear, and I'm sure many in the room might think this as well, we can't do anything about a story if we don't know who it is. Well, I can categorically say that is not the case. We can learn so much, and the public out there want anonymity by and large. Not everyone, but most people do. And they like the fact that they want it to be constructive. They want to see who's reading their story. They want to know how it's changing or not changing services, and accessibility is key. So I've just got a couple of examples of conversations on the site. We now have about 2,500 stories across Australia. I guess some of our success stories have been places like Western Australia, where the Health Minister has mandated patient opinion for all public hospitals. So we're starting to see a real momentum across the state in terms of this way of engaging with the public to help improve services. But it's also important to note that over half of the stories on patient opinion are positive. And I think this is something that we miss in our services, is learning from those stories and the good stories. What it is that's appealed to these folk when they've donated their gift of their story. How can we sort of shape staff morale around those stories? The other thing to point out too, only about 60% of the stories on patient opinion are by patients. The other 40% are from carers and family, friends, advocates. Even staff are writing on patient opinion about how the services might improve, or writing on behalf of patients. For example, in mental health secure areas where staff are writing on their behalf. But this particular story was a tough one. It was a recent story. They were grateful in a very tough circumstance and suggested of new ways of transitioning from paediatric to adult care. So it was posted by a mum with a child with cerebral palsy, and things didn't go well in the surgery, but the mum was very understanding and grateful for her child's care. She also had suggestions about how things could be done better, and the care team has asked her to be involved in co-designing their services. So even though they didn't know who this was initially, the further conversations online, she was able to feel the trust with that organisation and was able to share and engage with them in person. The story, you won't be able to read that, I don't think, but you can see it's only just recent. It's been read 400 times by the public. It's quite a lengthy story. It's probably about 3,000 words that the person's posted, the mum, and it's about Princess Margaret Hospital. And basically her teenage daughter was feeling very unwell, and what they wanted to do was to insert a feeding tube for that particular person, and the surgery went wrong. The peg had gone through the colon, and she would have had to have surgery to resect her bowel. So this is the mum writing about this. So something that went horribly wrong in the surgery. But she's saying, you can see there, the staff, they spent a number of her daughter spent a number of days in ICU, and she's basically saying the staff were wonderful and very complimentary about the care, even though things had gone wrong. 53 staff members, meaning people at the service, 38 of them there, and some of the board members of East Metropolitan Health Service, as well as the Australian Committee, are reading the story. So these are people that are what we call public interest bodies that are reading the story, and they can see what's going on, but it's not like Facebook where you can interject. That conversation is between the storyteller and the health service. But the staff are being email alerted with it. And when the service responded, in this particular case, it was the Executive Director for Royal Perth, he responded, I love his responses. He's very empathic. It's not a bureaucratic response. He engages immediately within 24 to 48 hours, and he writes in a way that's compassionate, warm, caring, kind, and says, thank you very much for taking the time to share your experience, especially during what must have been a very traumatic time for you and your family. And he writes about that. And then another staff member commented as well after that, so wrote a response. And this person, Susan, was the coordinator of Nursing Education Research and Patient Flow Unit in the child and adolescent area. And she also wrote a response. So this person, this mum, is feeling the love from this organisation. Within 48 hours, she's feeling heard, she's feeling listened to, and engaged, and that people care, which is very unusual, very different from what you might say traditional ways of engaging with the public. So that outcome is still, it's a good outcome. She had some suggestions about what they could do differently, particularly that transfer from paediatric units to adult care, and that organisation has changed the way they do things because of her story. So they're looking at sort of a PDSA, a Plan, Do, Study, Act, the quality improvement activity around that. Another story, this one a little bit more challenging as well, but posted by a family relative saying that they were getting nowhere fast with treatment for their child who was going deaf. And it involved a few organisations. The beauty about online feedback is it can cross organisations, and people can be email alerted across the organisation so they can see what folk are doing. She was quite frustrated around the wait list and how to access help quickly. Felt like she was being, this was 3 weeks ago, felt she was being pushed from pillar to post, and it's already been viewed quite a few times. This one didn't get published for a few days because it's strongly critical. You can see up there it's a criticality of 4. We rate that from 0 to 5, 0 being positive, and about 60% of our stories are zeros, and then a 4 or 5 being like a typical complaint. We get about 8% of our stories are 4s and 5s, and this would fall in that category. And we usually do a bit of work behind the scenes to make sure, gather some more details, and then we put the story up at the same time as the response from the service. And in this particular case, she wasn't really happy with how she was not being seen to. So quite a few people were watching this story, as well as the public. There are 105 staff members, so you see there, actually there's 33 missing there. They couldn't fit it on the screen, but there's 48 at the Child and Adolescent Health Service in WA. And then there's quite a lot of these district health advisory councils that are looking at the story and looking how that service is responding to this particular story. And the response came back from Barbara, and it went up at the same time. We would generally help people respond if they need the help. So we let this one go through because even the responses from services are moderated by ourselves. because sometimes we don't think they're extremely appropriate from the service, so we would go back to them and say, look, here's how other people responded, what do you think of this? Generally, it goes through to the keeper though. This one here's asked them to contact them. A lot of our responders tend to say, look, we respect your privacy and your right to remain anonymous, and we really value that. If you don't want to get in contact with us, that's fine. And then they can still do things with the story. But in this particular case, the storyteller has been in contact with the service. In fact, the storyteller wrote back on the site. So again, all those 105 watchers see the response from the storyteller, responding back to the response from the service. So in this particular case, it wasn't the relative that responded back, it was actually the mother responded back and said, thank you for posting our story and provide this response as written by my relative. So with regard to that service, she felt that more could have been done, and she's contacted the paediatrician's rooms. Still no action. So fortunately, there's been action on this, and things are happening. So if I go back to that original slide, it's really about building these relationships with the people that use our services in a very sort of public way, but a way that's safe and moderated, and can lead to change. This particular service did some tag bubbles. That's where the storytellers will put words around what was good, what could be improved, and how they felt. So in this particular service, you can see there the green are all the positive bits about the service, and the pink is around what could be improved. And within each, the bigger the bubble, the more stories are contained within that bubble. So just to finish up really, I guess to say that feedback really should be about resolving issues, restoring those relationships, and hopefully reducing complaints in real time. We can see feedback as measuring and as looking at how we perform along a continuum from poor to excellent. But I think when we start seeing feedback as really dynamic and something that we can all learn from through the service, then I start to see the value of feedback. And we often talk about the stories that people post on the site as giving us a gift. But that gift needs to be treated with care and nurtured in a way where they can see that it is, and it builds trust between the organisation and those using the services. And also builds trust across the community. And this is what we're seeing in WA now, that in Western Australia, that local communities are seeing that it's a trusted site, that when people tell their story, it's treated with care, responded to quickly, and they can see change where change is needed. So that starts to build trust, and we're getting many more people writing on the site. And I guess one of the examples of that is we're now having lots and lots of Aboriginal communities writing on patient opinion in the Kimberley region, because they now feel they can trust that their story, their yarn on the site will be treated with care. So I think that's a really important thing as we all learn from those that we serve. I think we're collecting a lot of data around patient experience, but are we seeing evidence of change? And I think many of our feedback systems might be one way rather than two way, where people do feel heard. And I often say this, and I believe it, and I think there's a lot we've got to do around this area. If you are collecting patient feedback in your organisations and not sharing it with all your staff, then you really will struggle to change that staff culture or help people see through the eyes of patients or walk in their shoes. That patient experience is everybody's business. It's not just the patient experience manager or the chief experience officer or the safety and quality unit. It's everyone's business. The challenge is how do we get folk within the organisations everyone to see that feedback and those stories and help move them. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Cheers. If there's any questions at all?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions which Katie will comment comments from the Twitter sphere?
Okay, so I've got a question from Nicole, who thinks patient opinion is a great resource, but is interested in how well health services have accepted the platform.
Yeah, it varies, you know, from this end to that end. So we have what we call the patient opinion journey of health services, and it ranges from a 0 to a 9 on that continuum of organisation. It's really about organisational culture and public online feedback. So we see organisations at this end where we don't want to know about it and we want to put our heads in the sand and we want it to go away, to a little bit along that continuum of actually we should explore this a bit further and see how it integrates with what we do, but we'll sit it within comms rather than within safety and quality. To organisations up this end where they really have that attitude with all staff should be learning from this. We want all our staff to be email alerted with stories relevant to their department. We don't want everyone responding, of course, only certain people respond, but it's really around public online feedback, everyday business. That's how we do things.
And just one other question from Kat regarding whether GPs are able to be included in the process, or is it just hospitals?
At the moment, it's mainly larger organisations like hospitals, but we do have quite a few drug and alcohol services involved as well. GP practices, short answer, it's just not happening. We have tried, but I think, and one of the things we do, we don't name, we're getting a lot of stories around GP practices, but we don't name the practice. We put the practices in the electoral district of Barton, because we don't want to name them. That's not what we're about. And you'll know we remove names from the stories. Any staff names are removed. Any patient names are obviously removed, unless they're positive stories. So, but it's something that I think, well, I know in the UK we've now got 2,000 general practices involved, and they see it as something that they enjoy. But I think in this country it will take a little bit more of the journey to see that the sky doesn't fall down when you engage in public online feedback.
Michael, I have a question for you as well. I work in WA in the public health system, and we use this system. I've noticed that the people that do respond within our organisation, I presume they have some sort of training. Is that something that you do, or is that done within the organisation so that responses are appropriate and as you say, empathetic?
Yeah, generally an organisation will nominate 2 or 3 people to do the responses, and we'll do a bit of training with them around that. I mean, the site's public, so you can go into any organisation, and we often refer them to, I mean, there was a chap, the CEO of Eastern Health in Victoria, was just phenomenal. He's so compassionate in his responses. So we would just say, here's the link to how he responds or how he was responding. But we do a bit of training with folk as well. And it really does vary, the responses. Some organisations, you know, must follow various protocols, and that's fine. But it's, again, they're on a journey. I think everybody's on a journey of moving to that, you know, to those, stretching themselves really about, it's really about connection, isn't it? If you think about patient opinion, it's about connection between those that provide the services and those that receive services in a safe space that we can all learn from. So response falls into that category. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.